As a friendly reminder, if you would, please refrain from speaking while our next speaker is giving his presentation so that those around you can hear what's going on. I'd like to introduce our next speaker. It's Patrick Stiles. He is a financial advisor with Waddell & Reed in Franklin, Tennessee. He began his career with Waddell & Reed in 1999 and has spent the last 13 years helping clients put together a solid plan to save and invest for the future instead of worrying about factors outside their control. Some of his first clients were court reporters, and he has been a previous speaker at past TnCRA annual meetings. So if you would, welcome Mr. Stiles.
Thank you very much. I'm absolutely certain there's nothing you'd rather be doing on a Friday afternoon than listening to somebody talk about money. So I appreciate you letting me be here. As Allison said, my name is Patrick Stites. I'm with Waddell & Reed and have been for the last 13 years. And basically, I want to make sure you understand my job is not to make it so you don't enjoy your money today. And always have to be saving it for tomorrow. My goal is to make sure that you enjoy what you're doing today as well as are able to enjoy what you want to do in the future. So that's kind of where I want to start. I don't take myself too seriously. I enjoy what I do. And I got really nervous when I agreed to do this, and then I found out that it was an hour-and-a-half time slot, and I thought, oh my goodness, how in the world am I going to talk for an hour and a half? But then I realized that y'all sit and listen to attorneys all day, so I wasn't worried about that. So, financial advisors are just below attorneys on the humor scale, I guess. But no, anyway, I'm excited to be here and wanted to spend just a little bit of time talking about just some very basic planning and money concepts. And then I have some more in-depth things, because the difficult thing in speaking to a group of this size is to realize that we have people who are just starting, and we have people who have been saving or investing or have made very good financial decisions for their whole lives. And so somehow I have to entertain that whole group, and I want to make sure that I at least leave you with something that you find beneficial. My wife says that I'm kind of weird because I really love facts and figures and numbers. And actually I have a good friend who's a court reporter, and her husband and I were driving down to Destin, Florida earlier this year. And just to kind of give you an idea of how my mind works, and fortunately his worked the same way. If you've ever been to Destin, you know that there's the Mid-Bay Bridge. I don't know if y'all know where that is, but it costs $3 to drive across the Mid-Bay Bridge. So my friend and I spent about 30 or 40 minutes of our 7-hour drive trying to figure out how much money they collected in a day by figuring, approximately X number of cars would cross this bridge in an hour, and there's X number of hours in a day, and so that's how much, came up with. So we got to the house, and we were so excited to share with our wives that we had figured this number up, and they were less than impressed, and turns out we were way off, but our math wasn't right because we were trying to do it without calculators. So anyway. So I appreciate you letting me be here, and want to start with the obvious, which is everybody says, why in the world would I want to do anything with my money now, because look at the mess we're in. And so I want to start with talking about how the more things change, sometimes the more they seem to stay the same. And before we get into that, I want to do something a little bit different. And most speakers probably speak for a while and then ask if there's any really pressing questions. I'd like to flip that and start and say, does anybody have any pressing questions as it relates to money and finances and the economy at this point? So this is your chance. What's that? What money? There you go. Okay. So no questions to start with? Pocket change? Hey, it beats nothing, right? Okay, well, we'll start here then. So in each of these slides, my company tells me I have to show you all these disclosures, which says I'm making no guarantees about anything. And how many of you have ever worked with a financial advisor? Okay, some of you. How many of you don't trust financial advisors? Okay, Good. Hey, you're honest. I appreciate that. I can appreciate that because I know stories of people that haven't had good experiences, and then I know people that have had great experiences. All of my clients have had great experiences. So. But anyway, so in all of this discussion, I'm making no promises. I'm not guaranteeing anything. I'm not telling you that if you do any of what I'm telling you, you're going to make money. So the law tells me I have to tell you that. So you've heard it. All right, so everybody knows that we just came through, and we are still in the middle of a horrible recession. And so that's kind of where I'll start, because a lot of people say, what money, as somebody over here said, why in the world would I invest when things are as bad as they are? And so I want to talk a little bit about exactly where we are and kind of how it relates to your situation. So the U.S. economy is approximately $13 trillion. And that's a lot of money. We're the largest economy in the world. I think China just overtook Japan as the second largest economy in the world. So $13 trillion is a lot of money. But we've obviously been in a recession, and most of you probably know the recession is just a slowdown in economic activity. It's typically where you have business growth is slowing, you have housing is slowing. Our economy just 20 years ago was at 7.1 trillion. So even while we've slowed down quite a bit, we have increased almost 90% just in the last 20 years. So yes, we're going through a slowdown, but we've been through a lot of slowdowns. So some of the things that led to ours, and again, some of this is kind of old news, but just to kind of bring us back to where we are today, a lot of what got us into the recession we're in now were some of these factors listed here. Everybody knows reckless lending practices, obviously unethical behavior, which is why we have people that don't trust financial advisors. Loan defaults. We had inflated asset prices, specifically real estate was the big one. How many of you heard at some point that you always make money in real estate, right? There's a lot of people that don't believe that anymore because they bought houses or bought land a few years ago and then have seen the prices drop 30, 40, in some cases 50% or more. And then one of the other things that happened is we had a lot of people who were ignoring risk, who were just saying, well, we can do this because even if something bad happens, you know, it can't get as bad as, well, where we are today. So most of what I deal with is the stock markets, and a lot of people at this point are not very comfortable with the stock markets, to put it mildly. And if you understand how stock markets work, it's very simple. It's like any other buying or selling. A normal stock market works when you own a stock, which is ownership in a company, and you go and you find somebody who is willing to buy that for a certain price. So assume that you have a stock that you want to sell, an XYZ company. You want to sell that. You're not forced to sell it. You're just a willing seller. So you go out into the market, and the most popular is the New York Stock Exchange, and you look for a willing buyer, someone who is not coerced into buying your stock. So let's say that you bought a share of stock last year, a year ago, for $5, and today you decided to sell that, and the price of that stock was $6. Well, that $6 was the price that a willing buyer and a willing seller met and agreed upon before you sold yours. So you sell that for $6, but just before you sold yours, there was another buyer and another seller that agreed upon $6.50 to buy their stock or sell their stock. So you just made 20% on the sale of your stock, whereas the person just before you has lost almost 8% on the purchase of their stock because they bought it at $6.50 and you sold yours at $6. So that's a normal market. So the prices are constantly changing based on what a willing buyer and a willing seller wants. An abnormal market, which is what we went through several years ago, is where you have people who are coerced or you have unwilling sellers, and typically you don't get a lot of unwilling buyers, but you have sellers who are forced to sell for some unknown reason. You can have unwilling buyers, but people usually don't buy if they don't want to. So when you have that, when you have unwilling buyers and unwilling sellers, most of you have heard of the butterfly effect when it comes to chaos theory. Chaos is basically when you have all these people doing things that they really don't want to do, but they're forced to do it in some way. The butterfly effect was introduced about 40 years ago. There's a meteorologist named Edward Lorenz at MIT. And he made the discovery that very tiny changes in climate could bring about enormous and volatile changes in the weather. And I'm sure some of you have heard this before. So he called it the butterfly effect and pointed out that if a butterfly flapped its wings in Brazil, then these small disturbances in the air in Brazil could travel through the atmospheric system and could eventually produce a tornado in Texas. So that's kind of what started with our economy back in 2008, is we had these little things that started happening which produced enormous negative results at some point down the road. So that thought, or the theory of the butterfly effect, has been passed on to other market or other areas like science and the markets as well. There's two main drivers in the stock market, and y'all probably heard them before: fear and greed. So fear, and most of you have heard of Warren Buffett. Warren Buffett says that he likes to be fearful when others are greedy and greedy when others are fearful. So what he's saying is, when everybody else is rushing out to buy because they're trying to be greedy and they're just investing based on nothing more than speculation, which we saw back in 1999 with a little thing called the internet bubble. But he also said he liked to sell when everybody else, or liked to buy rather, when everybody else was fearful. So that's what we had back in 2008 when everybody thought the world was coming to an end. So both of those can drive the market. Fear can and greed can. But obviously greed drives it higher, fear drives it lower. 2008 is what we might call a black swan, where it's something that probably couldn't happen. And if you've never heard that term before, a black swan refers to the assumption that all swans are white. And then back in the 1800s, they discovered some swans in Australia that were black. But they were very, very rare. And so the black swan effect basically says this is something that probably can't happen, but does on a very rare occasion. Typically, a black swan is a complete surprise, has a major impact, and is explained in hindsight, since hindsight's 20/20. So we had that back in 2008, and then what happened? The government came in and said, all right, we're going to fix this. And so, and I may be going more into what y'all wanted to hear, but this kind of leads into some of the other stuff. So the government said, all right, we're going to get involved in this. That's what's called Keynesian economics. And that comes from a guy named John Maynard Keynes, who said that the more government intervention is better because they can smooth out the rough points in the road. So in our economy, the government jumped in back in 2008, started throwing money into the markets, or into the economy rather, to try to smooth out some of those bumps. Some of it may have worked, some of it may have not, depends on your perspective, and in many cases your political leanings. So, but I'm not getting into that. I'm not crazy. So the question is, the more things change, we've been through this before, or have we been through this before? One of the big things that affects a lot of us is just the media, and y'all have heard that. That's nothing new, and you may have seen something like this before. So in March of 1958, the Dow, which is just a measure of how the market's doing, was at $611, and Time magazine has a lead article or headline article that says the recession, how deep and how long. Just a few years later, 8 years later, 1966, same thing. How bad is this going to be? The Dow's up to 804. In 1974, so less than 10 years later, same thing. We're worrying about inflation. You know, the economy's terrible. Keep going. A few years later, 1979, talking about OPEC, the world over a barrel. The Dow's at 852. A few years later, 1981, the market's getting the hatchet. A few years later, 1984, worried about the deficit. Some of this kind of sounds a little bit familiar. Then we have a few years later, 1980, or actually a little bit later that year, 1984, we've got trouble. 1990, we've got trouble. 1999, the Dow's at 9,200, talking about who's going to save the economy. A few years later, back in 2008, they show a cover article with people standing in soup lines back from the Depression. And then just a few years ago, March 9th of 2009, the Dow was at 6,500, and they show, you know, everybody's holding on for dear life. Today, the market closed at around 13,000, if you look at the Dow as a measure. So I just point that out to say, yes, it really stinks, and yes, it seems like things are never going to get better, but it will. So, now do you have any questions? What's that? In our lifetime? I sure hope so. So here's what I want to jump into is instead of worrying about the things we can't control, obviously there are things that we can control. And we can control what you have coming in and then what you have going out. And I know as court reporters, your income is obviously very determinant upon the business that you have coming in, the jobs that you get. And having worked with court reporters for the last 13 years, some that have been in business for a while, some that were just starting out, I understand that. I know that there's good years and there's bad years. And it shocked me to learn a few years ago that the economy actually affects your profession. I would have never thought that. I would have never thought that the economy would have had an impact on court reporting, because I figured people are always suing or getting caught or going to court. But I learned that it does. So the most important thing for you is to figure out what's important about your money to you. What do you want for it to accomplish? And so some of you, the lucky ones, got a little book that as you came in, we had a little miscommunication, so I didn't bring enough. So if you're sitting by a friend and your friend has one, I'm fine if you want to make copies of that and use it for yourself down the road. But you can use this book to help you look at some of these questions that we're going to go through. And it's certainly not something that you can do in 20 minutes. It will take some time to sit down and think through it. But what I would like to do today is help you just sit down and think through where you stand, where you want to be, and what you need to do to get there. Okay? So I promise I'm not selling anything today, so you don't have to worry about that. I just want to provide some valuable information. And if you find it valuable, let me know. If you don't tell anybody else. All right, so what's important about money to you? Where's your money go? Cash reserves. These are some of the things I want to cover real quick. I'll talk briefly about taxes, briefly about retirement. If you have questions about sending your kids to college, we can address those. I probably won't go into estate planning just because we won't have a lot of time. So what's important about money to you? Typically when we work with people, and some of you have seen this before, and I think I even went through this several years ago when I was at the court reporters meeting, but you want to build on a certain foundation. A lot of people go out and they start investing. That's the first thing that they do, and there's no foundation. So when things get uncertain, that foundation gets very shaky. What we always encourage people to do is start with your risk management first. What are the things that I can't afford to lose? As most workers can't afford to lose their income, because if you lose your income, there's nothing else you can do. If you're married and you're dependent upon a spouse, you can't afford to lose the income of that spouse. You can't afford to lose your home. You can't afford to lose your car. Those are the things that you insure, and that's kind of the basis of risk management, is finding the things that you can't afford to lose and having somebody insure that for you. And that's all that insurance is making sure that what you can't afford to lose, somebody else is willing to pay for. So that's the first step. Second step is making sure you've got a little bit of cash available in case some of those things that you weren't expecting happen. The next stage then is accumulating your money. Step after that is getting to retirement, generating that retirement into income when you need it, and then there's other things that may be important to you. As you're working through that, what we call financial planning pyramid, taxes and estate planning are two things you got to watch out for. So we'll touch on those briefly. So where's your money go? That's the big question. You've got two people, one that saves a lot and one that doesn't. It's a pretty easy question. Who's going to be better off? But before we get into that, I want to show you one other thing briefly. Oops. And I'm very disappointed I missed the talk on punctuation. That sounds more exciting than this to y'all probably. All right, so there's the disclosure again, if you don't mind reading that. Okay, so before we talk about our money, let's talk about the world's money real quick, because sometimes it's a matter of perspective. So there's 5 different stages to society, and you can decide where you think we are. But the 5 stages of societal growth, first one is agrarian, which is where you're basically farming to live. Okay. The second is exporting. Third is urbanization. Then you've got domestic consumption, and then you've got prosperity. Where do we fit on that scale so far as a country, as a society? Prosperity, domestic consumption, prosperity, probably somewhere between those two. So typically the first step is an agrarian stage. You've got economies where people have to farm to live. They're not farming because they're going to turn around and sell it. They're farming because that's the only way that they can live. Fortunately, I don't think we're in that situation right now. So all of our money doesn't have to go into producing just the necessities of life, hopefully. Hopefully we're a little bit beyond that. But growing crops for self-sustenance. So you've got to have the right geography to be able to do that. You have to have a population or have to be able to increase your production to do that. You've got to be able to divide the labor. You have to have somebody that can support that growing. So fortunately, we've kind of grown out of that, okay? Second stage is exporting. You've got societies where now we've produced more than we need, so let's export that to somebody else, all right? So the U.S. probably got into that position 100, 150 years ago, where we started exporting more than what we were producing because we had enough. The next stage is urbanization. That's where you start building cities. People start moving from the country to the city because now fewer and fewer people can create food and create what you need to live, and so now you can go find another job. So we go into urbanization. The next step then is consumption. Some of you said the U.S. may be there. Some of you said we're more at the prosperity stage. But the domestic consumption stage is probably where the U.S. was back in the 1950s, where we had people coming back after the war. We had the post-war boom. You had more and more people that were able to stay home. You had moms that were staying home and not having to work. And you had household wealth growing and consuming like crazy. And then the last area is prosperity. And that's the freedom to be able to ask, what if? And that's the goal where we as financial advisors want people to get to, is to the point where you can just ask those questions, not how am I going to live tomorrow, but what if I had enough money to do these things? And it's not playing the lottery, by the way. So, sorry, I'm a numbers person, but I can't remember all of them. So let me give you an example. These numbers are for China, okay? So China has 1.3 billion people. It is the most populous country in the world, and it's 20% of the world's population. So there were 563 million people in 1950, so they've almost tripled in 50 or 60 years, greatly surpassed the number of people in the United States. However, 800 million of those people live in the agrarian stage. So we feel like we're doing pretty well, but here's an economy where 800 million people, which is almost 3 times what we have here, or 2.5 times what we have here, are making about $1,000 a year. So we're doing okay, all right? Then there's 200 million people who make approximately $3,000 to $4,000 in US dollars. All right, so those people are starting to move into the exporting stage, where they don't have to create crops or create their food. Then there's about 120 million people who live in the cities in China, and that is, let's see, 120 million people who live in the cities. Those people make about $6,000 per year, okay? So we think we've got it tough, but here's an economy that's growing very quickly, and there's a reason I'm sharing all this with you. So then you've got another country, India, which is scheduled to be the most populous country in the next 40 years, okay? Similar situation. 70% of their population is agrarian. 35% of that population is actually involved in producing their own food. All right, one of the things that they have to deal with is the geography and just the technology to be able to get to where we are. Now, here's an interesting fact. In India, there's 650 million people that use cell phones. There's not that many people in India that have access to indoor plumbing. So there are more people in India that have access to cell phones than there are that have access to indoor plumbing. And I share all this with you because as all of these economies grow, here's another one. In Brazil, there's 7.2 million fewer homes than what they need in Brazil. Okay? They had a program years ago where the government started helping people buy homes, and this talks about all the different areas of the world that are currently growing. So the U.S. is in a position where we can not only export, not only do we have prosperity, but we can use that to help other countries grow as well as grow our own wealth. So going back to thinking about where your money goes. Feels pretty good to not have to worry about whether we're going to create our food or not. But in that packet, and you can do this just on your own, and some of you may have, where do you spend your money? That's the number one question I always ask people when they say, can you help me figure out what I need to do differently? Because most people have no clue where they're spending their money. So if you sit down and look at it, and I apologize, I should have looked up, I don't know what the average income is for a court reporter. Is it 75,000? Is that close? 75,000? All right, let's do a quick calculation here. I'm not going to do it in my head or I'll mess up. What's 75,000 times 40? Anybody know? 3 million. So the average court reporter, if you work from age 25 to age 65, will make $3 million over the course of your lifetime. Now, when you get to age 65 and you look back at that and you think, wow, I've got nothing left, that's not a very happy thought. It can be a little bit depressing. So that's the number one thing, is figuring out where you're spending your money. Once you figure out where you're spending it, then you got to say, okay, I need to put a little bit aside. I need to figure out what my emergencies are going to be. What are my planned expenses? That's things like putting some aside for when your car breaks down. You don't have to take money out of your retirement account to fix your car. Cash reserves, you want to look at putting some money in some place that's very safe. You don't want to put that in the stock market. All right, everybody's heard that. You don't put your emergency funds in the stock market. You want to put it in something that pays you a little bit of interest. You want to get a little bit of liquidity, which means you can get to it quickly. You want something very low risk, and you don't want to have to worry about penalties. So even a CD, although they're safe, is not the place where you want to put your cash reserves. And then the other thing we talked about, kind of that base of financial planning, is what if? What if my home burned down? Could I afford to replace it? If not, you need insurance. What if my spouse died? Could I afford to live without their income? If not, then you need insurance. What if somebody totaled my car on the way home? Then if I can't replace it, you need insurance. So insurance is kind of that next step, that basic building block. And you need to make sure you can cover all the things that are important to you, whether it's your mortgage, education, covering debt, final expenses. And I'm going very fast through this, so stop me if you've heard this. So nobody likes talking about insurance, so I'm going to skip over that. Any more detail on that? But I do want to talk about how money works, because this is where a lot of people really get tripped up when it comes to planning for the future. So if you've got one of the books, you can look at there. There's a little chart there that talks a little bit about all these different types of investments. So let's take CDs, for example, because most people are familiar with CDs and how they work. There's 6 different areas here where you can rate each of those things. So would you say that a CD is relatively safe? Most people would. Okay, so you would give that a mark. Would you say that they're liquid? Probably not, because you typically have to pay a penalty if you need to get to it. Would you say that you can get current income from it? You could, although not a whole lot right now if you've got any CDs. Can you get income and growth? Probably not very significant growth from a CD. No growth we talked about. Do you get tax treatment? Not usually, unless you do that within your IRA. So each of these things you can kind of go through and look at and see, okay, where do these fall in this scale? So if you need safety and liquidity, which we talked about for your emergency fund, those are the things you would use for that. If you need growth, which is what you're looking for the long term, then those are the things that fall under there. And talking about growth, I want to jump into the exciting part about your money. The cash part is okay. It's nice to have it, but Cash doesn't do that much for you. The most interesting thing to me is what's called compounding or compound interest. And some of you may have heard before that when asked what's the greatest miracle known to man, Albert Einstein said, the magic of compounding. So there's a pretty smart guy who looks at this and says that's an amazing thing. And all that it means is if you put $100 in a savings account today and they give you 5% interest, you make $5 in a year, right? In year number 2, you don't make $5 in interest, you make $5.25 of interest. In year 3, you don't make $5.25, you make $5 and a little bit more based on that 5% growth rate. So the rule of 72 says, think about where you are today and how much money you've got saved up, whether it's $1,000, $10,000, $100,000. And if you want to know how long it's going to take you to double that money, look at what your rate of return is. So if you're getting a 6% rate of return, divide the number 72 by the number 6, and it'll take you 12 years to double your money. If you're getting a 7.2% return, it'll take you 10 years to double your money. If you're getting a 10% return, it'll take you 7.2. So I'm sure y'all can do math. You can figure that out. Where that's very exciting to me is if you've got, let's say, 30 more years to invest, or let's say you only have 20 more years, it's very easy to figure out where you need to be and what kind of return you have to have based on your time frame. And so this is a very easy way or very quick way for you to figure that and to figure out, here's where I stand today, how much more am I going to have? Questions about that? So if you look at this chart, it shows you if you invested $100 a month that grows compounded based on an 8% return, what would it be worth? And this illustration is assuming that you put in here we go. So this is assuming you put $100 a month, put that in, you can see the growth rate over a 25-year period. So the orange line is what you put in, the yellow line is what it's growing to. That's kind of how it works. Now, let's look at a real-world example, and you may have seen this. So let's assume you've got $4,000 that you could put into your IRA. You put that in at 8% growth rate. In 30 years, if you put in $4,000 a year before taxes, you would have about $489,000. That's a pretty good amount to have saved up for retirement. If you're paying taxes on that as you go, the amount that you have saved up would only be $335,000. So I mentioned earlier on that pyramid on the side, we saw taxes and estate planning as some of the concerns. Here's why. And so I mention that because when you start talking about retirement planning, tax deferral is a very, very valuable part of that. We've got 2 investors, just to kind of show you an example of why you want to start as quickly as possible and do as much as you can as early as you can. So we've got 2 investors here, and I apologize if your name is Polly or Pete. I didn't make up these names, but that's what they put in here. So Polly decides to start investing at age 25 and puts in $4,000 a year for 10 years. So she puts in $40,000 starting at age 25 over a 10-year period. Leaves it invested, gets an 8% return, which, by the way, 8% is not an astronomical number. That's not an unrealistic number over a long-term period. But she gets an 8% return. She ends up at age 70 with $925,000. If you're 25 years old, I'm sure you're very excited right now. So, but let's say you've got Pete who decides he would rather enjoy all of his money today instead of putting a little bit aside. And by the way, $40,000 is just a little bit over 5% of a court reporter's average annual income, just in case you're wondering. But Pete decides he's going to wait till he's 35. So at age 35, he puts $4,000 in, but he does it for 30 years. So he puts in 3 times as much money as Polly, but because he started 10 years later and because he didn't have that time for his money to grow, he only ends up with $744,000. Now, I say only because he had to put in 3 times as much money to end up with about a fourth less. Make sense? Great. So, mentioned earlier, some of the enemies for your money is going to be, number one, taxes. the frustrating part about taxes right now, as many of you know, how many of you are self-employed? Vast majority of you. Okay. So y'all love paying taxes, right? Seeing that Schedule C and all that you made, and then paying your 15% on that. And then income tax on top of that. So. But taxes are a big concern. Inflation, which is just the cost of living, is going to be another big concern. And there's nothing you can do about inflation because we have zero control over that. The two things we can control are the amount of taxes that you pay and the amount of debt that you have. And we haven't talked a lot about debt, but I think everybody pretty much knows that debt's not good. So I'm going to skip through that if that's okay. Actually, I'll back up just a minute. So when we're talking about taxes, if you're paying taxes and your money's growing, then you have to earn more money in order to end up with the same amount of growth. So for example, the 8% there in the middle, we were talking about that. If you're in a 15% bracket, which is the long-term capital gains tax rate, so you have to actually earn 6.8% on your money to actually get 8% because you're paying that 8% in taxes. Okay? If you want a 10% return and your money is not tax deferred, well, now you've got to get an 8.5% return. Or I'm sorry, you've got to get a tax-free equivalent yield of 8.5%. So you see that taxes can have a big impact on how you're growing your money, which is why one of the things you always hear financial advisors talk about is IRAs, tax-advantaged opportunities. How many of you, well, I won't ask that because I don't want to embarrass anybody, but an IRA is just an individual retirement account. It's very simple. Anybody can set one up. The only requirement is you have to have earned income. So if you have a 12-year-old child that's working somewhere and they have earned income, they can set up an individual retirement account. Imagine what that could grow to over 60 years, okay? So anybody can set up an IRA. The benefit to an IRA, you put that money in, you take it off of your income this year. So if you make $75,000 this year, you put $5,000 into your IRA, you're only going to pay taxes on $70,000. I like that. I'm not a big fan of paying taxes, personally. So you put that $5,000 in, and then from that point forward it grows, and I pay no more taxes on that money until I take it out. To me, that sounds really good because I have no clue what the tax rate's going to be next year. They could come out next year and say the tax rate on investment earnings is 50%, and I have zero control over that. I do have control over where I put it to avoid those things, okay? There's some other ways that you can save money on taxes, whether it's municipal bonds, annuities, and we don't have time to go into all that. A lot of you may know the benefits of home ownership and the tax advantages that you get there. But for the purposes of today, I want to talk a little bit about that, the IRAs. So here's one of the advantages, to make it simple. So if you've got $4,000, you just put it into an account. It's not tax deferred. You're going to pay, if you earn $4,000, you're going to pay $1,000 in taxes on that if you're in a 25% bracket. So you've got $3,000 to invest. At 8%, you're going to make about $240. Then you're going to get taxed on those earnings at about $60. So your net savings is about $3,100 at the end of the year. However, if you take that $4,000 and stick it in something tax deferred, the benefits could be much greater. Assuming that you're in a 25% bracket, you pay $0 in taxes because you just deferred that from your income. So the IRS looks at that and says, hey, you didn't have $4,000 in income, so you don't have to pay taxes on that. So you've got $4,000 to invest, 8% earnings, $320. You pay no taxes on that earnings because it's in your retirement account. So your net savings at the end of the year are $4,320. So more than $1,000 than you would have if you did it non-tax deferred. Okay? That's what really excites me, not because I can guarantee you an 8% return, not because I know that your money's going to grow, not because, we are the smartest investors in the world. I'd like for it to think that we are, but you probably could figure out otherwise. The reason that excites me is because I have complete control for myself, and you have complete control for yourself over where you put that money. And you can immediately realize those benefits of some kind of a tax-deferred account. So, in thinking about retirement, which I know everybody's loving to do on a Friday afternoon at 6 o'clock. So where's your income going to come from? These are just some estimates from a 2009 survey. 25% of people's earnings in retirement are going to come from working. 25% of their income. 40% is going to come from Social Security, which I don't know if I want to rely on that. How many of you have gotten a Social Security statement recently? You should get it. You should get it about 3 months before your birthday. If you actually read that, if you read the Social Security statement at the very front, it says, we will not have enough money to pay this out. I mean, actually admit that. And I heard, I think it was this week, that the Social Security Trust Fund is now going to run out of money in 2033, which is 5 years earlier than what they were expecting. So that's exciting, that I'm putting all that money aside and you're putting all that money aside and it won't be there when you need it. All right? So I know I'm flying through a lot of this, and my purpose is just to help you think about some of these things in a little bit different way. And so there's one other thing I want to show you. What time is it? Please.
What do you think about reverse mortgages?
Reverse mortgages. What do I think about them? Reverse mortgages, for those of you who don't know, is if you own a home, and let's say your home is worth $300,000, you get to retirement and say, well, I had fun, but I didn't save anything up for retirement, so now I have no money. The way a reverse mortgage works is there's a company who basically pays you the equity in your home over a monthly basis. So they can pay it in a lump sum, but it's usually paid out to you monthly. So the benefit of doing that is you get a monthly income. So if you've got a $300,000 home, you're 70 years old and you retire, they may pay you a couple $1,000s a month until you eat up all the equity in your home, and then you get to live there until you pass away. And then when you pass away, the mortgage company gets to sell the home and get their money back. So the question is, what do I think about them? I think they're like a lot of other investment products in that they have some good qualities and they can be used in a good way. They've changed a lot over the last few years because, well, the government got involved, whether you think that's good or not. But they've changed a lot over the last few years because they're much more highly regulated, and consumers can't get in as much trouble with them as they could have, say, 5 or 10 years ago. So how many of you have heard something bad about annuities? Reverse mortgages? They're not. They're actually FHA. There are some now that are FHA sponsored, and there are very rigorous requirements now for reverse mortgages. I don't sell them. I actually have a client that does, and I don't recommend them, not because I necessarily think they're good or bad. I don't recommend them because I'm not allowed to. Our compliance will not let me do that for obvious reasons. It could end up being a bad thing. But I know very few people who've used them. So they're not, I mean, they're government sponsored. Not that that always makes it right. But what's that? Mm-hmm. But honestly, I don't think they're a scam, because really, if they're done correctly, all that they're doing is they're just giving you a home equity line of credit. They're just doing it in a different way. That's right. But here's the way you have to look at reverse mortgages, and this is just my opinion. It doesn't make it right, but I think it's right. But my opinion on reverse mortgages is if that's the only asset that you have, and there's nobody that you're planning on leaving that to, do you care if you die and there's a debt on that asset? So all that you're doing is taking money that you've put into something and taking it back out, and then when you die, somebody's getting paid back. So if the only thing that you have to leave to your children is your home, and your children don't need it, and you need the money to live, then it may end up being a good thing. And it may end up being something that can be used appropriately. But if it's something that your children are dependent upon, and they're expecting to get that inheritance, and they're expecting to get that money, it may end up being a very bad deal for you. So that's my opinion. Yes, ma'am?
I don't know anything about reverse mortgages, and I found what you just said interesting. What happens if I were to get a reverse mortgage today, and I died next year,
Mm-hmm.
and I
Mm-hmm.
What happens to the debt that the reverse mortgage people, that I incur to them?
Well, it depends on how you took that out, but the simplest answer is they're only going to give you a certain percentage, and by law, they can only give you a certain percentage of what your home is worth. So let's assume your home is worth $300,000, and they can only give you $225,000. And you decide to take that lump sum in the first year. So you take all of that $225,000 and go sail around the world and spend it all, so it's gone. And when you get back, you find out you have some, illness that you picked up in a third world country and you pass away. So there is a debt on that there's a debt of $225,000 on your home. The home's worth $300,000, hopefully. So the company sells your home, they take their $225,000, and your children or your heirs get the $75,000 that's left. That's the simplest terms. I'm not an expert on those by any means, so that's just the simple way. Yes, sir.
One question. In today's market,
Mm-hmm. Where would I put my money? Very good question and a very fair question. I've done all the things that I've talked about doing today without a reverse mortgage. My money is in the stock market. Let me introduce a new concept and I'll finish answering your question. When somebody says the stock market, instead of thinking of some odd place out there where your money goes and slowly disappears, think of it this way. Think of the stock market as great American companies, okay? Because that's what you're investing in, or great international companies. So for example, I'm glad you asked that question because I was getting over to that, but I'll finish answering it. So I put my money in the stock market. I put my money in the bond market, and bonds are just debts. That's all that they are. I've got money in short-term cash, which I suggested. I have, let's see what else. My home, I put my money into my home. I'm like everybody else. I also have a little bit of debt. I'm trying to pay off home and let's see, where else have I put my money? I have a little bit in, I bought a couple of gold coins a few years ago, just for fun, okay? I'm not saying invest in gold. I'm just saying I bought it for fun. I'm planning on leaving them to my kids, so that was just something I did because my great-grandparents passed down coins to me when I was little. So, but does that answer your question? Sure. Okay. Mm-hmm. Okay, so the question is basically, what are taxes going to be next year, right? and the short answer is, I have no idea. As it stands today, the Bush tax cuts are set to expire at the end of this year. And some of you may have heard recently that President Bush said, I wish they had named them something else because then maybe they wouldn't be considered such a bad thing. But those tax cuts are set to expire this year. And I apologize, I can't remember what the capital gains rate is going to go up to. I think you're right that it goes up to regular income tax rates at the end of this year if Congress doesn't do something to change it. So that is a tricky question. In my opinion and in our company's opinion, that is kind of the million-dollar question for our investors is what is the tax landscape going to look like next year? We have no idea because we don't know who's going to get elected. We don't know what the Congress is going to look like. It could be 100% all Republicans in there. It could be all Democrats in there. And we still may not know what they're going to do, which is why I go back to what I said earlier about the tax deferral. Okay, so it's a good question, but I don't know what the answer is. Yes, ma'am. To my knowledge, yes. Her question was if you have a husband and wife that buy a reverse mortgage and one of them passes away, does the other one get to keep the house and stay in it? To my knowledge, yes. Because more than likely that reverse mortgage would be in both names. But again, I'm not an expert on that, so don't quote me on that. Yes, ma'am.
I would like to know what kind of
what kind of kickbacks that we get? Uh-huh. Oh my goodness. What a question. I'm going to get behind the table as I answer this one. We'll just ignore the question because it's over there in the corner. All right, I'll answer that as quickly as I can. So the question is, what kind of kickbacks do we get? And I guess when you say we, you're talking about financial advisors, people like me. I'm not getting paid anything for being here today. I'll just say that up front. I did get a bottle of water. That was my compensation today. Let's see. We get paid in a lot of different ways, and I'll say it that way to say it very simply. I am in sales, and I'll tell you that, and I'm not ashamed to tell you that. So what I sell is my expertise and my ability to sit down and help people make decisions. Because what we found is a lot of times people know what they're supposed to do, but they just can't seem to do it themselves. And so they need somebody to help them do it. So financial advisors get paid a couple different ways. Sometimes they charge a fee for what they do. So a financial advisor might sit down with you and you pay them to help you go through something like this booklet that we handed out to help you figure out where I am today, where I want to be, and how I'm going to get there. So you may pay a fee to do that. If you're investing in mutual funds, financial advisors get paid based on the amount that you have invested in those mutual funds. So we do get paid a portion of what you have invested. Now, you can go out and invest on your own, and a lot of people do. But I don't change the oil on my car because I have no clue what I'm doing. And if my toilet breaks, I'm calling a plumber because I've tried to do plumbing, and it always leaks when I'm done. So there are some things that I've tried to do myself. I mowed my yard from time to time, but now I have somebody do it because I don't have time to do it. So we get paid based on sometimes the amount that you invest, sometimes the things that you invest in. I'm not sure I would call them kickbacks, but there are commissions. There are commissions built into products that you buy, just as there are if you go to the store and buy something. You know, if you buy a car, if you sell your house. So, ask your advisor. No, I mean, if I would sit down and very bluntly, and anybody can ask me, what am I paying you for doing this? And if they're not willing to tell you, that's a trust issue, and I would talk to a different financial advisor. I mean, that's the only way I can answer that question, and I'm not afraid to tell people that I make money off their money because most of the time they have more money because of what I've been able to do for them. Not always, but most of the time.
Don't you have certain regulations about how you
We do have certain regulations.
My son-in-law's in financial advisor.
Mhm.
He says he can't give me a deal.
He can't? That's right. Yeah, there are certain things that,
I don't think I should have to pay you to do that.
well, there are certain things that we can't, she's asking, her son-in-law's in the business and he can't give her a discount. That's true. There are certain things that if a product is sold a certain way, we have to sell it that way. We can't give a discount. So, no more compensation questions, I hope. Start asking y'all how you get paid. Next time I have to go to court, praying I never do, I'm going to find out how y'all get paid. Okay, let me show you one other thing real quick. Okay, so I know I've really kind of touched on a lot of things, and my point in doing that is just to get you thinking. I wasn't going to give you all the answers today. I'm sorry if anybody's disappointed about that, but I can't give you all the answers today. My goal is, and I'll be very upfront and honest with you, my goal is, if you're interested in getting some help, that you would give me a call. If you don't want to call me, call somebody else. But I would love to help somebody who's serious about making changes to what they're doing financially, okay? If you want to work with me, I'd love to help you. If you don't, I'm not going to be offended because I can't help all of you. So sorry, did everybody catch that disclosure again in case you missed it? Okay, so I'm going to jump into something else, and this may be for some of you who are a little bit more investing savvy or maybe who've already done a little bit, and if you've been bored, maybe this will wake you up a little bit. So there's two things when we talk about investing. And so I want to talk a little bit about the evolution of an investing idea. Because how many of you have been tempted or have thought about, hey, I hear Facebook's going public. I want to buy some Facebook stock. How many of you have thought that? Okay. So see, everybody's like, I want to buy Facebook stock. Well, maybe it's a good idea, maybe it's not. Let's see. So what's the difference between investing and trading? Investing refers to buying a stock or other financial instrument for a long period of time, typically over several years. Assessing good opportunities, makes use of fundamental information, blah, blah, blah. That's all boring. Trading refers to just buying or selling shares of stocks or anything else. You can trade in houses, you can trade in horses, you can trade in jewelry, I guess. But you typically do it for shorter periods of time, typically less than a few months. Usually if you're doing that, you're using some kind of a system to help you do that. So, there's an investment that's coming out, you want to invest in it. There's kind of a process you can look for and a process that we look at. You got to look at what is the viability of a new idea. All right, let me show you some things that, that you may find interesting. And again, I wasn't able to memorize all this, I apologize. All right, so you've got inventions, which the internet was an invention that Al Gore came up with years and years ago. And so that's an invention. And then you have a product. And that's something that is marketed or sold for profit. And to go back to the question of how we get paid, the product that I sell is my time and my ability to help. Okay, so that's my product. Your product is transcripts, right, okay. And it's even more than transcripts, though. Your product is accuracy, right? More than just the paper. Your product is accuracy. So then investing is defined as investing money or capital to gain profitable returns as interest, income, or appreciation of value. So how do you tie those three things together? Let me share with you four things. First, the microwave oven was invented in 1947. And on this, I started reading this was all over my head. But this guy accidentally discovered microwaves. He was building magnetrons, which as soon as I read that, I was lost. But he was building magnetrons for radar sets with the company Raytheon. He was working on an active radar set when he noticed that a peanut chocolate bar he had in his pocket started to melt. The radar had melted his chocolate bar with microwaves. So then he goes on, figures out, he builds the first microwave. 1945, the first patent was issued for microwave. The first one that was built was 6 feet tall. It weighed 750 pounds, and it cost $5,000. So it consumed about 3 times as much energy as today's microwaves. Okay, so that's the invention and the first product that came out of that. Second one is the car. Carl Benz developed the car in 1885. That is the Benz of Mercedes-Benz. But he developed the car in 1885. He got the patent for the invention of his first motor wagon in 1886. And he began production of his vehicle in July of 1886, created 25 vehicles that were sold over the next 5 years. So he wasn't a very good salesman, apparently. Cell phone was invented in 1946 by Mr. Shapiro and Mr. Zaharchenko. And actually, the first cell phone was a guy named Magnus Ericsson. He installed a telephone in his car in 1910, so 100 years ago. It wasn't a radio telephone, but what he'd do is he figured out he could go clip some wires onto telephone wires wherever he went and have a mobile phone. So a pretty smart guy. And then finally, in 1875, there was a Swiss gentleman by the name of Daniel Peter who came up with milk chocolate, created the first milk chocolate. Let's see. That process he invented in 1867. All right, that's all fine and good. Here's the cool thing. It took 28 years before the Litton Company was able to convert that product into a marketable product, the microwave. It took 23 years before Henry Ford was able to mass produce vehicles to make that a very marketable product. 26 years before the first Dynatac cell phone. Anybody have one of those back in the 70s? The bag phones, yeah. And then 31 years later, the Hershey's Kiss came out. Milton Hershey was selling that commercially. So here are these great products we look at today, and it took a long time for those to get to market. So some other technologies and the amount of time it took for them to get to American homes. And I'm sharing all this with you in the concept of What do I want to invest in? Do you want to invest in a brand new thing that may or may not be proven, or something that's been around for a while, or something kind of in between? So it took telephones 71 years to reach 50% of American households. It took the iPod 4. It's pretty amazing. So there's some other things in there. So back in 1999, I hope nobody invested in this. If they did, we'll hear them crying here in a few minutes. Pets.com, their motto was, because pets can't drive. So here's this company that came out and they said, we're going to sell pet products online. Company came out. The stock initially came up in the late 90s. Everybody thought it was a great idea. February 2000, the stock came out at $11, immediately went up to $14, shot up 30%. And then people thought, well, this is kind of dumb. What am I investing in? In the next 268 days, the stock dropped all the way down to 19 cents. So if you invested in Pets.com back in the late 90s, I'm sorry. So, sounded great at the time, didn't end up working out. However, there's another little company that a lot of people have probably been to. This is Walmart's stock return since 1972. Obviously, they didn't create anything other than a cheaper way to sell products. Now, whether or not you like Walmart or don't like them, or like the way they do business or don't like the way they do business, they've taken a product or products and figured out how to market those effectively. And therefore, it looks like Walmart might have been a good investment. Yes, sir?
Isn't that closely held corporation? Is that publicly?
No, Walmart's publicly traded. This information is a couple of years old. It's 2009, but it's still close to that. But no, Walmart is a publicly traded corporation. So that's kind of what Walmart's done. I wish I had bought it in the 80s. Little company out in California, fruit company called Apple. There's their stock return since 1984, and you can see how old this is because Apple's stock is now selling at about $600 per share. And I think this has it somewhere around 100. So a good investment. However, I know there's a lot of information on there, and I can't even read that, so if you're in the back, don't worry about it if you can't. These are all the products that Apple has come out with over the last 25 years. Kind of a little drawing of how they came out with them. Their stock price for the first 15 years really didn't do a whole lot. And then it really started going up when they came out with the iPod back in the early 2000s, mid-2000s. And then the stock price kind of shot up. So there's a company that we look at today and say, you'd be crazy not to invest in that. But had you been in it for the first 15 years, you might have been in for a lot of disappointment. So my point is, just because something's not doing great today doesn't mean there's not opportunities. And on the flip side, just because it sounds phenomenal today doesn't mean that it's the best opportunity for you. Because there's another little company called Enron that some of you may have heard about. So had you invested somewhere about right here, a few years later you would have looked like a genius until 2001 when it turns out that what looked like a great idea wasn't all that it was cracked up to be. And now the benefit that's come from a company like Enron is everybody knows the name and everybody knows the danger of putting all your eggs in one basket. Because that was the big story, is all these employees had all their stock in one company because that's where their boss told them to put it. Buy the company stock, buy the company stock. So that's just a good lesson on don't get too caught up in that. And this talks a little bit about our company as far as what we're looking at. But as you're thinking about investing, here's just some areas that we feel like, and these are not recommendations, but that we feel like may provide opportunities. You've got energy. I mean, our energy needs are going to continue to grow. And if you think about the 1.3 billion people in China and the more than billion people in India, where are their energy needs going to come from? So there may be investment opportunities for you there. Future of the medical business. You've got not only disease control, you've got designer drugs, you've got surgeries, you've got database access. You know, doctors' offices are more and more having to go electronic, so there may be investment opportunities there. Food, you know, what's the future of food? I'm not sure how I feel about genetic engineering, but you know, you got smart farms, fertilizers, disease control, pest control, yield enhancement, water. We don't think about water, we take it for granted, but that's a huge opportunity down the road. And then you've even got home appliances, the things that we take for granted, remote systems controls, virtual entertainment, entertainment on demand, custom food prep. Custom clothing. I have no idea what that is. I guess it means you walk in and your clothes are ready-made for you. But anyway, and I'm quickly running out of time, but what I just wanted to point out is there are always opportunities out there. And a lot of you may have made some good money investing. Some of you may have lost money investing. But the point is, as you're saving for the future, to look at all the different options that are available to you. So when it comes to retirement, you've got obviously tax-deferred savings. If you work for an employer, there may be a retirement plan. You can jump in there. And when you look at the amount of time that you have until retirement, and then I don't want to talk about Social Security. That's too depressing. Okay. So as you get into more and more of that, I can't go into all the details on how investments work and how all of that works, because for every individual it's different. Somebody over here raised their hand very, very high when I asked about Facebook. That may be appropriate for one person. It may be very inappropriate for another person. There have been a lot of new IPOs this year, and it looks like internet stocks are taking off again. But does that mean that we're going into another internet bubble? I don't know. Maybe, maybe not. But if you look at those magazine articles from 3 years ago, we all thought the world was coming to an end. And if I came to you and said, you really need to put your money in the market because things are great right now, most of you would have told me I was crazy. But here we are 3 years later, and great American companies, the value of great American companies has doubled in the last 3 years, from 6,500 on the Dow to over 13,000 today. And that includes a big drop today of more than 150 points. So the point is, put together a plan and take the fear and the greed out of your investing, out of your financial plan. And I think that's one of the reasons that I like this business is because I don't get emotional about it. I love what I do, but it's money, and it's very, to me, it makes sense because you put a plan in place, you do the right things, and your money will come back and reward you over time. So a couple more things I want to show you real quick. So if you can't see that, it says, I retire on Friday and I haven't saved a dime. Here's your chance to become a legend. So some guy talking with his financial advisor. Please don't do that. That doesn't work so well. This guy says, so you have to spend money to make money, so I bought myself a cabin cruiser, a luxury sports car, and a giant screen plasma TV. Not sure how well that's going to work. And then the last one. For retirement planning, I'd say your best bet is in Vegas. All right. So thank you all very much. I'm sorry for being in so many different areas, but I appreciate your time.